friends, and welcome back to the Social Audio Think Tank. Josh here from Australia. Today is a very special episode. We welcome Philippe Perez to the show in a really awesome interview that my co-host Jackson did recently. Philippe is a podcaster, a community radio host, and also an audio producer. And he talks in the interview about a new show that he's planning to launch, plus his experience with community radio in Australia. Some stations that he works for that have an international reach. So for you international listeners, it'll have a global perspective on much of what he's about to say about radio in general. So I know Jackson had an amazing time recording this one. I'm actually not in the interview, so I had to stroke my ego a little bit and get myself in here at the start just to introduce this one. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll jump back in at the end just to fill all you tech heads in on the technology used during this intro, during the interview, and also during the outro, which is all different. I think you might find that interesting. So we'll jump in with Jackson and Philippe now. Enjoy this interview about community radio, podcasting, audio production, all those things, and how they all go together.
Well, thank you, Jackson, for allowing me to be on your podcast. It's an interesting little podcast, and it's not every day that I get to talk about radio, so to speak. Where do I start? Well, should I just start at the beginning? Should I?
Yeah. So the day you were born, and you heard the radio, and you said, "I want to be that."
Well, okay. Let's start at the beginning. I was around about 19. Was straight out of high school, and doing a TAFE course in contemporary music. I had no idea what I wanted to do in life, but I was interested in music, and I was playing the piano a bit and dabbling in a band, which never really went anywhere. The thing I really got a lot of joy out of was listening to the radio, all sorts of stations, even the AM radio stations that are aimed at the more senior of the community, for the want of a better term. I'd actually be quite intrigued by how that radio was made, how the announcers enunciated, how they would throw to breaks, just the formats of the show by just listening to them. And what intrigued me was community radio. There was a roughness to it that I liked. As weird as that sounds, I just enjoyed hearing people make mistakes and kind of learning from them. And some shows on community radio were much more better than others. I got quite attuned to 2SER in Sydney initially, and then volunteered at a very small station in Gladesville in Sydney. And that station was called 2RRR, based in a little cottage. I hosted a youth program called Canvas Bag, and I did it with a friend of mine at the time. I did that show for about 2 or 3 years, and then moved on to doing different sorts of music programming for 2RRR. I got really involved with the station, being its youth director and being involved in the board. I was there nearly every week, if not twice a week, just helping out, volunteering at fairs, just doing general things around the house, so to speak, because it was actually in a cottage. The studio was not any bigger than this studio as well. It was very, very small. And it was just a wonderful little place to go and make music. I met a lot of friends through radio, and I went on to host a pretty synonymous show called The R Zone, which was hosted by a kind of a minor celebrity his name is Matt Curley. He still does radio for 2RRR. He's been doing it for about 25 years. And I took over his show, and I did it for only about a measly 3 years. But I went on to do various other things in radio from that point on. I got interested in volunteering for FBI radio in Sydney, which many people will know is probably the biggest community radio in Sydney. I volunteered there in various aspects, doing what they called music outreach. So I would hunt for new tunes, sometimes help out with their library. I would do overnights, occasional fill-ins for FBI. And then I moved on to doing radio at 2SER. And I probably spent most of my Sydney community radio days there for about 4 or 5 years, I think. I decided to head south, and after about a few months or so, still had the community radio bug, I volunteered for 3CR initially. I still do volunteer for 3CR. I volunteer for 3RRR now in various molds. I feel like I'm going to be here forever if I go through everything and anything I do at those stations. But I should also mention that while I was at 2RRR, prior to me being involved 2SER and everywhere else that I've mentioned so far, I actually got employed in the radio industry, and I work at SBS Radio, and I still do. And I've had various jobs. Initially, I was employed as what they called an audio operator, and it essentially involved a little bit more than just panel operating. You would kind of round up the job description as trying to keep the station on air. In the past couple of years, I've started being involved in podcasting. I have had a podcast out called the Tale Teller Podcast for about a year and a bit, which has been on hiatus for the better part of 6 months now, which was kind of focused on writing and people who... And, I'm going to be starting, hopefully, a new podcast very soon focusing on comedy. So that's me in a nutshell. I feel like I've been talking forever, Jackson.
Okay, so there's a lot there.
Yes, there is.
There's a lot to get into. I think the SBS stuff, although that's particularly interesting for me, we might leave that out for now. So let's go back to... Well, take us back. What was the thing that grabbed you about community radio? Why did you get hooked on community radio?
I have to attribute it to Matt Curley, the man that I mentioned earlier on. He was just really entertaining, and through him I found other entertaining people. It breeds a unique amount of community in some sense. You meet people who are very... passionate about what they do, and you can hear it on the radio. That's what drew me to community radio. There was something that I learnt about radio when I was at 2SER, and this notion of being involved in real radio, not radio that's fueled by advertising, not radio that's fueled by mic breaks that have to be 30 seconds. I like that idea of real radio, and I think that's what drew me to community radio.
Yeah, that's a discussion that goes on here at Southern FM. We're recording in a studio at Southern FM, where, yeah, that thing you said of it's real radio, and I think that gets sort of balanced with sometimes it's not always the slickest radio, but then on the other hand, it's sort of the most genuine radio. So how do you think that... Do you think that's sort of the same in the world of podcasting? Do you think there's that same sort of honesty there?
I think so, yes. I think podcasting is starting to evolve to a world where, I mean, every podcast nowadays that I subscribe to, or every second podcast, I reckon, has an advertiser or a sponsor on it. So there is a primary motive to make money there. But you would be more often than not finding people who are doing podcasting because it's a niche. It's like their niche, and they love doing it. I think people who do podcasting are very much in the same mindset as a community radio broadcaster, but rather than broadcasting to, say, a metropolitan audience or like an audience that only goes so far, even though we now have the internet and web streaming and all that kind of jazz nowadays, that type of broadcasting is available to anyone everywhere at any time. And it's easy to grab. It's not hard to understand. It's done very easily for people who are wanting to start. It's very user-friendly. Podcasting can be as complicated or as easy as you want, and it doesn't necessarily have to always be simple, you know? I mean, there's a podcast that's really gaining notoriety now called Welcome to Night Vale, which I don't understand at all. It's some sort of radio drama that when I've listened to it, I just don't understand. But it's raged with all my friends, and they love it. And so, you know, I'm not going to deny that because that's what they do. I'm not into it. It's serving a community in a sense, but it's not necessarily a geographical one like Southern FM may possibly be trying to aim itself at.
Yeah, we've discussed Welcome to Night Vale on Social Audio Think Tank before, because Josh was telling me how much he enjoyed it, and I said I didn't get it. But then I went back and listened from episode 1, and it's like, this makes more sense, but since then I've fallen off again.
Do you reckon it's like an audio drama? It's kind of harking back to those days where audio drama was a thing?
Yeah, I really like that. That's sort of the bit that first got me into radio, was listening to... I was really into Orson Welles, and I was listening to him doing War of the Worlds. I was like, yes, I want to do that. But then it's like you say, it's sort of closed. It's not really open in that everyone gets it. It's a very closed audio drama. You have to know what level to take it, which is interesting. I'm going to go back to what you said before about podcasting. Everyone has their little niche, and they're going to podcast and talk about that niche. But I'm going to flip that around again and say, does that niche exist in community radio? Is community radio more broad or more niche than podcasting?
That's an interesting question. In Australia, I think that community radio is much more broader than what podcasting offers, but it relies on a particular audience, depending on where you're from and depending on why you are listening to it. So community radio works in an interesting way, in the sense that people have community broadcasting licenses. Southern FM have a license, and 3CR has a license, 3RRR has a particular type of license. Triple R here in Melbourne has an educational license. Some community radio stations have a license to broadcast something in particular. So that's why you do sometimes have Christian radio stations that tout themselves as community radio stations, because they're saying that they're serving the Christian community. Southern FM would possibly be serving the community of the southern suburbs of Melbourne.
Yep.
So that you have community radios that have what they call a metropolitan license, that serve areas of communities as opposed to niches of communities. So in that sense, community radio as a whole have certain communities that they do serve, but in a much more bigger scale. I know, for example, at 3CR, we have so many radio programs that are very progressively left of centre and very much radical. If you look at the program guide in itself, there are so many different niche programs that range from bike groups talking about cycling issues to pansexual issues to arts issues, but all coming from a radical perspective and trying to give voices to the unheard. When you compare that to podcasting doesn't necessarily have a group collective about it. It's sometimes just one person, more often than not, talking into the ether. And it takes time to build an audience. Many times in community broadcasting, you already do have an audience there, although once again, community broadcasting isn't necessarily broadcasting to a large audience in the first instance. So I think we're talking minutiae kind of audience anyway. I think I've gone far away from your question, Jackson.
Well, the thing I was leading into, since you sort of have a foot in each camp, you got podcasting, community radio, and SBS isn't commercial, but it's more commercial than...
It's a public broadcaster.
Yeah.
We do have advertising, I should mention. SBS Radio does.
Well, there's the thing there is there's sort of the democracy of the content. With podcasting, people like it or people don't, people listen or people don't. With community radio, it's sort of the same, and then with commercial, the guy who's paying the bills decides what the content is in a way. So how do you feel about that?
In a community radio sense, it can be a very democratic process where you have a collective or one person make a decision, and it's mostly for the sake of the art of radio, and it's to serve a purpose. And it's kind of the same in podcasting too. I think people try and make that kind of radio to serve a purpose. In regards to SBS, there is a purpose as well to SBS, but it's on a much more larger scale. And we do try and serve once again a community, but it's unique in the sense that we do take advertising, we do have a managerial system, there is decisions made about what content can go on and how much percentage content goes into a particular program and how the program grid is structured. So in a way, I think there is a managerial difference in terms of how community podcasting and public broadcasting are all differentiated, where podcasting is at the lower rung, where you're the master of your domain. You can do whatever you want, really. You're not beholden to anyone. Even sponsors sometimes, sponsors, a lot of the time when you are doing podcasting, sponsors come to you because they like what you're doing. Community radio, sometimes you are restricted depending on your license. So, for example, you probably wouldn't want to apply for a death metal program on a Christian radio station. So, things like that.
Yeah.
Or you wouldn't want to talk about TV on Vision Australia radio, for example, because what's the point of trying to talk about TV when you're broadcasting to an audience that are vision impaired? So that's another thing I forgot. I actually do volunteer for Vision Australia radio as well. I forgot to mention that. But
I'll add it to the list.
Yeah, add it to the list. SBS Radio does have a managerial system, which I won't go too much into because I actually am not really privy to what goes on in the managerial structure. I'm not a manager myself, so and it'd be wrong for me to kind of explain how it all works. But it's not necessarily a station that asks people to fund it, much like podcasts sometimes do, and sometimes more often than not, community radio does.
On the community radio level, it's not going to be the death of community radio if the government cuts community funding. But there was concern, at least at Southern FM, and I imagine probably many other stations, is we have to figure out how to become self-sufficient, basically. And there was sort of a thought in the back of my mind, maybe that wouldn't be the bad thing. Maybe that would see a boom in Australian podcasting. Do you think that's likely? Do you think if community radio gets downsized, will podcasting get upsized?
Where will regional radio go then, Jackson? No, in all honesty, regional community radio will die a slow, painful death. And it's sad because those stations are particularly in need to survive. City stations are very much needed too, but that's what I worry about. That's a main concern for me, because a lot of the time these regional centres have the ABC, who have their local programs, and that's it. Everything else is either a commercial radio station or an AM talkback station that feeds their content from one of the major capital cities, and it's not serving those communities very well, and it's not right. If that money goes, where do those stations go? That's something that I worry for, and it will cause communities in those areas to feel more isolated.
That's actually a really good point. I'm talking about the content of community radio and podcasting, but actually podcasting doesn't have that community sense. There's not this is the podcast for this town. It doesn't exist. Podcasting is sort of a global audience. Well,
you could. I mean, there are podcasts that I know that pertain to particular areas. I mean, the whole of the ABC's Radio National podcasts are very much Australian-based. But in saying that, you don't see many podcasts that are very localized. And, yeah, I suppose for the want of a better explanation, people try to make it as broad as possible to try to cater for many, many people, which I don't think is a bad thing. I don't know. It's sometimes weird to kind of stumble on a podcast that comes from, some random town in Alaska or something like that. It's strange. The podcast that comes to mind straight away, and this is a very weird example, is the I Love Green Guide Letters podcast.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, that is a very localized podcast for Melbourne in particular, because If you go to any other city around Australia, no one will know what the Green Guide is. And if you are from outside of Australia, you won't even know what Steele Saunders or any of his guests are talking about. They're talking about Australian TV shows. It just won't make sense to anyone. So you do still have those kind of podcasts out there, and they have moderate level of a success. Some have amazing success. You probably could say that I Love Green Guide Letters is an amazing amount of success. But it depends on how you define success for a podcast.
Yeah. There's a great one out of Adelaide. I think it's called Another Boring Thursday Night in Adelaide, something like that, which I was really impressed with the first time I heard it. It was so localized to Adelaide, but it was really entertaining. So I think my mission is I'm going to go find localized podcasts, because I think that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, I think, there are plenty of them out there. I personally feel a little bit alienated listening to them sometimes. Do you feel alienated listening to a podcast that talks about local things all the time?
Well, the I Love Green Guide Letters one, I was telling Josh on this very show a few episodes back that I really like that because it mentions stuff like he talks about Carlisle Street, and I can go, yeah, I've been there. I like it.
Fair enough.
But yeah, the Adelaide one, if they're making references to things that I don't understand, and that's the point where I go, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes podcasts are acquired tastes too. I get sick of podcasts sometimes, depending on what they're talking about. It doesn't necessarily have to be local. Could be also subject content, certain attitudes that are displayed on podcasts. I don't know. There are various reasons why I get a little bit alienated from them.
So I think we've decided then that there's not necessarily... You're in these three worlds of public broadcaster, community broadcaster, and podcaster,
yes.
But there's not necessarily a lot of crossover.
Thinking about it now, you're right. No, there isn't. I don't seem... how can I cross over, Jackson? Seriously, how can I? I can't really... I don't know. I find that I diversify myself in all those three different fields because I try to find new ways of making radio. Yet another thing that I forgot to mention, just recently, I've just contributed to a really wonderful podcast called All the Best, which is a radio kind of documentary podcast. Some people compare it to This American Life. It's basically it incorporates radio stories, radio dramas, radio documentaries, things like that. I think when I particularly started volunteering and making documentaries for that particular podcast, I realized that I'm still learning stuff. I'm still learning things that, I could never learn in a public broadcaster world or in a community radio world or in a podcasting world. Although All the Best crew do broadcast over the community radio network. So there's a bit of crossover between the podcasting world and the community radio world. And thinking about it now, SBS Radio itself do delve into podcasting. So, there is a crossover there, actually. I probably am jumping the gun and trying to, rule out that there is any crossover. But depends on which way you look at it.
I also just recently got turned on to All the Best after the event that you and I both attended. And hopefully we'll have the curator also interviewed in the future. I'm going to give you the ultimate question now. Of your three mediums, which is your favourite? No pressure. This is the deciding question.
See, if I tell people to listen to this, Pat Jackson, from all the three worlds that I delve into, look, it's not a cop-out. I don't feel it's a cop-out. I do genuinely like them all the same. I like to think of myself as being a big fan of audio. I love audio. I love the things that you can do with audio and content through your ears. I've never been a big fan of TV. I don't like visual stuff. I mean, I do occasionally like to go to the movies,
Or be on the TV.
Yeah,
yourself.
well, yes, that is very true. We shan't mention that. But yes, I mean, I don't really... I'm not a big fan of videos or anything like that. I'm not really too interested in the YouTube kind of thing. I love radio because it makes your imagination go wild, and it can be an individual experience for every person. While if you have something that you're seeing in front of you and you're entertained by something that you're seeing, there's much more of a relayed message that is being sent out to an audience. Radio can be one-on-one, and it is more often than not one-on-one and very personal. So I don't like to say that I prefer working at SBS over being a volunteer for community radio, or being a volunteer for community radio over doing my own podcasts or contributing to podcasts. I like them all the same.
I think that's probably a perfect answer, really. So I think we've got a lot of information from you there.
Yeah.
But before we go...
I hope I haven't bored everybody.
No,
it's just like... I do do a lot of stuff, and I think I've only just touched the surface of all the stuff that I do. But, I mean, yeah, anyway.
Well, why don't you give us a plug for anything you want, really?
Well, geez, Jackson, where do I start? People can follow me on Twitter. I normally put stuff that I do via radio up on my Twitter, and you can find me at P_Perez. I do a bit of writing as well, so I put all that stuff up there as well. But also people can find little snippets and audio demos of what I do at clippings.me/Philippe Perez, and you spell that PHILIPPEREZ. You can listen to my kind of on hiatus podcast, the Tale Teller podcast, if you go to thetaletellerpodcast.blogspot.com. I'm going to have a new comedy podcast coming out fairly soon, and it's essentially going to be a comedy interview podcast. It may also be broadcast on 3CR, but we don't know that yet. We'll see how we go with that. But keep your eye out for that soon too. And if people do want to hear me on the actual radio, you can hear me on Friday Breakfast on 3CR between 7 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. on 3CR every Friday, of course. I do a kind of an experimental music show every Monday from 11 p.m. until midnight. And, yeah, like I said, that comedy show might be coming up sometime in the near future too. So, yeah, I'm everywhere. If you just Google Philippe Perez, you'll probably find a little bit more about me as well.
Excellent. And I highly recommend everyone does all of those things. Thank you very much for appearing on Social Audio Think Tank, Philippe.
Thanks, Jackson. I really appreciate it. It's been really good to talk about radio. It's interesting to be on the other end of the radio spectrum, answering questions rather than asking them.
Hey friends, Josh back again. Just wanted to run through the tech that was used in today's interview there with Jackson and Philippe. Bit of a cracker, that one. I really enjoy listening back to that one myself. So I'm going to go through the intro, the interview itself, and the outro. So I'll start with the outro now, as I'm currently recording that. The microphone I'm using is a Heil PR40 into a Cloud Microphones CL1 Cloud Lifter, which is a clean gain boost. So if you're using cheaper gear, or whatever gear you're using is a bit noisy when you turn the gain knob up, either the recorder or the mixing desk, using a clean gain boost, which is built just for that purpose of boosting your signal without extra noise, can be really, really handy. It also means you can get a good level without introducing a lot of extra mechanical and electrical gain sound from different devices that you're using. I'm running that into an MG102C desk and outputting that directly to a Roland R-05 wave recorder. This setup is slightly different to how I recorded the intro, as I used a Rode Procaster, an Australian-made broadcast mic, into the CL1 Cloud Lifter, the Yamaha desk, and the Roland. Obviously, we can't do a side-by-side comparison, as the intro of the show was quite a while ago now, but I find that the Rode Procaster is a better and more flattering sounding microphone on my voice, And one thing that I find with the Heil, more so than other microphones of a similar price, is that it's very, very sibilant on my voice. And I have a very sibilant voice. And I'm intentionally not going to EQ this section of my recording. So you can actually hear that there's more than likely a lot more sibilance in my voice than there was during the intro, even though all of the other gear I'm using and all the settings on the desk, everything is exactly the same. So for anyone out there that does have a very sibilant voice, I would suggest maybe staying away from the Heil PR40, as it will accentuate that frequency range pretty aggressively, and you can put a lot of people off when it sounds like razor blades in their ear. So overall, it's a much fuller sounding mic, I find, than the Rode. Just for my particularly sibilant voice, it doesn't suit anywhere near as much. And for the interview itself, the major portion of what you've heard today, both Jackson and Philippe were using Sennheiser MD421s. They were recording in a controlled environment at a radio station into Logic Pro. So for today's full list of gear, for the intro, the interview, and the outro, you can go to socialaudiothinktank.com/radio-isode. So that's radio-isode, isode, so radio-isode, and you'll be able to see the breakdown of all of the different tech. And if you were to listen to the episode again, even if you skip through, you'll be able to hear how different things sound and different pieces of gear within the one episode. So once again, thank you. Thank you to Philippe for giving us such great information and providing such an amazing interview. Thank you to Jackson for his hard work putting that one together and organising the interview and all that sort of stuff. And finally, thank you to everyone who has supported the show so far and supported the Oz Podcast Network, of which Social Audio Think Tank is a member. And if you wanted to show your support, you can go to patreon.com/OzPodcast. So Patreon is patreon.com/OzPodcast, OZ Podcast. And there's many levels of support you can show there, or just share that link around. Okay. Once again, it's Josh from the Social Audio Think Tank saying thank you from myself and Jackson, and we'll talk to you soon.
We were just the warriors. We were just the warriors, home and away, fighting for a piece of you. Just a little moment slipping away.
Listen to Australian podcasts. ozpodcasts.com.au